this is the sentence in intention which bears most directly as the closest connection with Mr. Truman's degree. The man pumping the author cannot profess not to have had the intention of doing it.
I went to, well, I grew up.
It was a means to an end.
Yes.
Yes.
In War and Murder, I find that at the end she has that kind of question and answer, which is much clearer than the original exposition. So I think there's somewhere there where she's just.
But I went to Brother Rice High School.
You went to Brother Rice?
Yeah. If something is your chosen means to give end,
So we're warriors. We can still be warriors.
And
it's incredible.
she clearly says it in the main body of the text,
I went
but
to
so
Brother
that
Rice.
it's the most direct statement. Like this is the principle.
Wow. So you
And she
were
also
there
gets at
for the
how to
transition.
line all this kind of wiggle room to sort of talk herself out.
That also bears a difference between consequentialism and what she calls old-fashioned utilitarianism.
Yeah.
The erasure of the distinction between the false and
Yeah, that's
which makes the doctrines of effect in Precepts.
right.
My brother goes to so
Yeah. In terms of teaching, persuading people how part of the goal is there's a kind of public discipline to what you get to say about what you intended, such that I mean, this goes to sort of Candace's point about sort of, it's not all in your head, but
Even what's in your
Usually
head
when I
isn't
meet people from
yes, right,
they
yeah.
bond one together. So then they hate me.
it's like a mental policy.
We have Professor Vogler speaking next. We're really excited to have her. She's one of the preeminent Anscombe scholars coming down all the way from Chicago for this weekend. She is the David Claire Stern Professor of Philosophy there and also principal investigator on a project called Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. She's written 2 books, one on John Stuart Mill and one on an essay in moral psychology. She writes and has interests in philosophy, literature, cinema, psychoanalysis, gender studies, sexuality studies, and other areas. But her primary research interests are, of course, Elizabeth Anscombe, practical philosophy, Kantian ethics, and neo-Aristotelian naturalism, none of which makes any sense to me. But we're really excited to have her. And she's going to give her talk on, I believe, the meaning of human life, or Anscombe life.
We mentioned in the first session with Professor Wicks that we're at several points in the last session that you're thinking something about human good, what's good or bad or needful in human life when you're working with Anscombe. I actually made a paper because I wanted to try to use this occasion to talk through some of the general aspects of Anscombe's approach to questions in ethics, and then turn and look at some of her material on, you could say human dignity, but I actually think that the sanctity of human life is probably the more accurate description. So I apologize for reading a paper, but I don't know any other way to get through this many bits of Anscombe at once. Okay. At least as early as 1960, Elizabeth Anscombe made arguments drawing on thought about things that are necessary in the sense that without them some good cannot be or come about, or some evil be expelled or avoided. Okay. She drew this sense of the term necessary from Book 5 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, which is what she called Aristotle's Dictionary. And she later described the source passage from Aristotle as a, quote, pregnant remark, end quote. In the early paper, her midwifery drew from the pregnant remark her thought about moral authority. Quote, the authority to declare to someone else what is true, in this case what is right and what is wrong, and to demand that they accept what one says and act accordingly, close quote. It informed her discussion of the authority of a state, where, again, authority is, as she puts it, a regular right to be obeyed in a domain of decision. More generally, it underwrites her account of rights and her account of rules. All turn on how some possibilities of good are created and then made actual through our understanding, deployment, and obedience to the dictates of what she called stopping modals. We're going to be at least that far into the weeds of Anscombe land. We're going to talk about stopping modals. She writes, quote, I want to arouse interest in what I'll call stopping modals. These are, of course, negative. Corresponding positive ones we might call forcing modals. The negative gets priority. It is, I think, more frequent than the positive, which restricts one's action to one thing, just as thou shalt nots tend to leave you freer than thou shalts. Close quote. This is part of the reason she thought you could not build a whole moral code from moral prohibition. It tells you what not to do, but it leaves open a vast array of things you can do that might be good to do under the circumstances. She continues, you have to and you can't are the first words used by one who is making you do something or preventing you, and they quickly become themselves instruments of getting and preventing action. After all, once this transformation has taken place, the following is true. In such a case, you are told you can't do something that you plainly can, as comes out in the fact that you sometimes do. At the beginning, adults will physically stop the child from doing what they say he can't do. But gradually the child learns. With one set of circumstances, this business is part of the buildup of the concept of a rule, with another of a piece of etiquette, with another of a promise, with another of an act of sacrilege or impiety, with another of a right. It is part of human intelligence to be able to learn the responses to stopping modals without which they wouldn't exist as linguistic instruments, and without which these things, rules, etiquette, rights, infringements, promises, pieties, and impieties would not exist either. Really strong statement. Close quote. By tying our capacity to operate with stopping modals to human intelligence and to the practices of human reason, Anscombe links the capacity to distinctively human good. Rules, rights, and the like are linguistic instruments caught up in making possible such things as economic and legal systems. The moral education of children, peaceful modes of conflict resolution, good manners, and so on. In this sense, the capacity to use, understand, and follow the strictures at issue in stopping modals is, as Peter Winch put it, humanly necessary. Anscombe's development of Aristotle's remark may be one of the most important aspects of her legacy in contemporary Anglophone practical philosophy. For while Anscombe used her work on these topics in support of David Hume's famous observation that both the existence of such things as promises and the obligation to do one's word were, quote, unquote, naturally unintelligible, an anti-Humean form of contemporary ethical naturalism draws some of its inspiration, sustenance, and direction from Anscombe's work on this topic, a topic that Philippa Foot named Aristotelian Necessity. Foot's work on natural goodness grows from this strand of Anscombe's thought, and some of Michael Thompson's work, to which Foot owes a special debt, can be read as a concerted effort to provide a more detailed, more thoroughly articulated, more advanced, and more clearly defended version of this strand of Anscombe's practical philosophy. At the center of Anscombe-inflected neo-Aristotelian naturalism is the thought that we can account for a great deal of ethics by thinking about what is needful in human life generally. When we think about practices like promising, virtues like justice or courage, and institutions that serve to produce, maintain, and help to reproduce well-ordered social life, we can make some headway in understanding both our topic and its logos or ratio if we consider the sense in which our topic makes some forms of human good possible, and even in some cases actualizes the very good made possible thereby. It is against the backdrop of thought about human life and what is good for the human as such that claims about Aristotelian necessity get some traction in this region of contemporary Anglophone practical philosophy, the area that neither of us likes to call virtue ethics, but that is named as such, not so much by practitioners as by anybody else. I'm going to focus on Anscombe. I'm going to start by trying to disentangle different ways in which thought about Aristotelian necessity informs her practical philosophical writings, with special emphasis on her discussion of stopping modals. On the face of it, at least, very different kinds of negative considerations are at work in stopping modals, according to Anscombe. I'm going to try to say something about what they have in common. Having tried to isolate what her varied examples share, I'll consider how thought about human good gets caught up in discussion of stopping modals. Finally, I'll turn to cases where she thinks that appeal to what is generally needful in human life fails to help us understand the point or force of a family of key ethical considerations, even as she holds fast to the idea that the sphere of the ethical is the sphere of distinctively human life and distinctively human good. So far, okay? Yes, okay. Aristotelian necessity is a fairly broad topic, as Anscombe understands it. She gives a wide range of examples of stopping modals that express Aristotelian necessity. Among them, you can't wear that, and you have to move your king. Unlike Aristotle's examples, needing to take a drug to relieve physical distress, needing to sail to Aegina to collect a sum of money, the special subclass of interest to Anscombe does not point to some contingent facts independent of the stopping modal in order to trigger its applicability. So for Aristotle, circumstances are triggering the applicability of something like the stopping modal. For Anscombe, there is no independent circumstance that triggers the applicability. Her stopping modals seem to have three interrelated distinctive features in common. First, the justification for you can't do such and such, or you have to do such and such, does not involve mention of any additional fact in support of the prohibition or prescription. If you can't do such and such because it's ends to do, hence you have to let end do it, and this expresses end's right or obligation, then the right or obligation is partly constituted by the fact that it's not anyone else's place to do the thing in question. Okay. And there's very few of these things that are quite like that. There are certain sorts of intimacies that my husband can only have with me and that I can only have with my husband. These are mine to do with respect to him. No matter how much he needs the relevant thing, nobody else is allowed. They're his to do with me. No matter how much it would comfort, soothe, or amuse me for somebody else to do it, nobody else can. That's a stopping modal territory in this sense, okay? The prohibition and prescription are joint aspects of the relevant person's right or obligation. They're two sides of one coin. Okay? Second, the because clauses that you might attach to the prescription or prohibition, in this case, because N is the only one who has a right or obligation to do such and such, do not provide extra reasons to do or forbear doing the thing in question. Instead, they help to classify or thematize the stopping modal, forcing modal pair. The stuff of the because clause is in the same sense dependent. Anscombe writes, quote, "Let me now restrict the word reason in the context of action to something independent which someone puts forward as his reason for what he does. And let me adopt the word logos, I might also use the word theme, for the second half of you can't because when the two halves are not independent. I shall say that there are various logos types, and they name of the general logos type, that they name is an abstraction from many particular cases, a label which tells you the formal character of the stopping modal." Sorry, that's a really complicated thought in a massive, huge sentence with lots of dependent clauses. So, to say that there's a set of musts, can'ts, and cans that are related in my marriage is to show that we're in the general logos type of things to do with chastity, basically. Does that make sense? Okay. So that tells you the formal character. These are chastity regarding stopping modals and forcing modals. Okay. 3. Learning to deploy and abide by stopping modals of a logos type is learning both the concepts associated with the logos type and the practical orientations that actualize the relevant logoi. The typical way in which this happens is through social interaction standardly governed in accordance with the relevant logoi. So, for my husband or myself, the phrase, "I'm married," is supposed to stop certain kinds of interactions. Right? Certain questions, certain suggestions, certain things, right? "Sorry, I'm married," is enough. It just settles the whole region. Okay. Now, recall again Anscombe's remark about how moral education works. Quote, "With one set of circumstances, this business is part of the buildup of the concept of a rule. With another of a piece of etiquette, with another of a promise, in another of an act of sacrilege or impiety, with another of a right. I take it that that list is a sample list of logos types." Compare, quote, "One does not learn morality by learning that certain propositions, ethical ones, are true, but by learning what to do or abstain from in particular situations and getting by practice to do certain things and abstain from others." That's her thought about how we build up these things. Our capacity to operate effectively with stopping modals, then, is grounded in the order they help to provide in our shared social lives, and serves to help participants work to realize those very kinds of order in those very domains of decision. Now, how does Anscombe's work on stopping modals connect with the way in which philosophers like Foote and Rosalind Hursthouse turn to thought about human nature to illuminate work on virtue, on human flourishing or happiness, and a host of other ethical concepts? Recall that Anscombe remarked that the practical education at issue in deploying and abiding by stopping modals counted as an actualization of basic human capacities. Now, we are the chatty animals, the discursively rational ones. That word discursively rational is something you could take by translating Aristotle as being on about what was chatty, or looking at anything in Aquinas. Sorry. Anscombe takes a step in the direction of more recent extensions of her thought, precisely by linking her exploration of stopping modal, forcing modal pairs to thought about discursive human reason. and her specific discussions of rules and rights generally, and in the specific context of her discussion of authority, make direct reference to common human good, to what is generally needful in human life, in a way echoed by more recent neo-Aristotelian work. For example, when invited to locate the source of the obligation to do one's word, the sense in which I do not merely risk being reproached if I break my promise, but deserving reproach, Anscombe points out that it is generally needful in human life to get other people to do things, and that this need dramatically outstrips anyone's power to get others to do his will because they love him or fear him. Quote, thus, she writes, quote, such a procedure as promising is an instrument whose use is part and parcel of an enormous amount of human activity and hence of human good, of the supplying of both human needs and human wants, so far as the satisfaction of these are possible. It is scarcely possible to live in society without encountering it and even being involved in it, close quote. Of moral authority, she writes, quote, the authority to declare what is right or wrong, virtuous or vicious, however distasteful it may be, is a sort of authority that can hardly be denied to exist by the most recalcitrant moral philosopher, for it is exercised by people bringing up children. And if there is such a thing as authority of a commanding kind at all, or if there is such a thing as a right, this authority and this right can hardly be denied, since it's quite necessary, if children are to be brought up, that their bringers up act as if they were exercising such authority. And since what is a necessity can hardly fail to be a right, so anyone who wants to bring children up must have this right, close quote. The requirement that we bring up children, of course, is perfectly general. No society is possible without meeting the requirement, and the bringing up of children is what makes it possible for children to come into their own as the maturing, discursively reasoning social animals that they're born to be. In her discussion of the authority of the state, by a similar token, she argues that the right of civil authority to back up its strictures with coercive force, although it must have some standing and custom, can't be merely a customary right. She argues that people in general need protection against violence and also protection in law against violation of their customary rights. Partly because we're vulnerable to personal violence, partly because different systems of customary right can clash within a single complex society, and partly because we have come increasingly to inhabit complex societies, we need the kind of civil authority that's lodged in the state. The authority is nothing other than the state's claim to our regular obedience in, for example, matters of the establishment, promulgation, and enforcement of positive law. Of course, the state can forfeit its right to obedience if it fails to discharge the tasks for the sake of which we need civil authority, and it can overreach its authority in some areas if it enshrines or extends a customary right, say through legislation, beyond what one might call a reasonable limit. What matters for my purposes is that in all these cases, Anscombe adverts to Aristotelian necessity as a way of arguing for a right, a rule, an institution, a practice, and the sorts of practical dispositions that might actualize these in the lives of practitioners without appeal to particular customs or instances of positive law or contract or pure principles of reason that might seem to operate independently of the business of specifically human life. By the same token, appeal to Aristotelian necessity can give some leverage in arguing that what is taken to be a customary right could actually count as a customary wrong. Anscombe then finds in perfectly general thought about what's needful in human life a source of support for some substantive ethical claims and a check on others. The sort of justification at issue on both sides is actually instrumental. Uses of stopping modals are instruments for creating and actualizing possibilities for human good. We need virtues in order to live well. Some forms of authority are required in human life if we're to manage to do the things that we must, and so on. Aristotelianly necessary matters in Anscombe's practical philosophy are collective means to common ends, where the commonality points to shared human nature rather than to some amalgamated measure of private interests that happen to crop up in any particular group of human beings. Part of what Aristotelian necessity can sometimes explain is why some such interests might crop up in many members of a particular group of human beings. For example, interests in marrying or making contracts or raising children. Now, we can quarrel with Anscombe's justification of the state, noticing, for example, that the reach of the modern state dramatically exceeds the reach of, say, a Lockean umpire state. We can doubt the extent of the authority of bringers up of children. We can notice that Anscombe does not argue that individual people will tend in general to go along with any of it, even if the justification for the relevant forms of obedience rests in what is humanly needful. In short, we can raise any number of concerns about her substantive use of thought about what humans in general need to provide such justification, but the basic form of argument she develops in these specific contexts has been undeniably attractive to many philosophers working in contemporary neo-Aristotelian ethics. And while I do not think that she should or even could accept every such development of her teaching, for better or worse, her teaching has inspired an entire school of contemporary Anglophone moral philosophy. That's part of the reason that I want now to have a look at her sense of the points where thought about Aristotelian necessity fails to illuminate crucial aspects of the ethical. And some of this got noticed in Professor Doyle's remarks last session. In a recent essay directed primarily to Foote's account of natural goodness, Anselm Müller traces out Anscombe's concern about attempting to rely on thought about Aristotelian necessity to capture the whole of the ethical. Müller stresses that the kind of justification that Anscombe offers, relying on this kind of thought about human good, is fundamentally instrumental in character. The good or point of the virtues, rules, rights, institutions, and social practices that Anscombe finds in appeal to what's generally needful in human life sees the objects thereby justified as instruments for satisfying these general needs, as ways of promoting or actualizing human good. The justifications are, in a peculiar sense, utilitarian. For Anscombe, not all utilitarians are consequentialists. Mill, she thought, was not a consequentialist utilitarian. I think she's right. Anyway, although the beneficiary of the good in question is not, in the first instance, an individual or a group of individuals or a mass of human individuals. The good in question is, as I mentioned, in a special sense common good, where the common good need not be the good of any arbitrarily large collection of individual human beings. On Müller's reading, Foote attempts to use Anscombe-style thought about Aristotelian necessity to reach all the way down to particular individuals facing particular practical situations. This is, he thinks, why she seems to take it that the why should I be moral question will cease to arise once we have fully appreciated the character of natural goodness. Because Foote ties morality explicitly to rationality, a why be moral question looks like it will slide towards something on the order of a why be rational question. And there are well-known arguments to the effect that it's hard to see how such a question ever could be given a sensible answer. You know, like, what are you going to do? Give a reason? Although Anscombe explicitly links her discussions of stopping modals and forcing modals to general concern over human intelligence and the activity of human reason, she never takes this extra step, the one that Foote's taking. Okay. More than this, she comes to reject the suggestion that all important points about the virtues and their exercise can be grounded in thought about what is humanly needful. Miller puts her point this way, quote, Anscombe came to argue that not all of virtue can be understood as serving our well-being, or rather, since virtue belongs to the human form of life, so that all virtuous conduct is part of our well-being, that some of virtue's requirements could be said to serve a human life, the good in a human life, it only happens in the sense that the satisfaction of these requirements is an ingredient, not an instrument of human good. It's part of it, not a means to it. He continues, where a virtuous practice cannot count as virtuous because it serves an aspect of human well-being other than the practice itself, we cannot explain its goodness in terms of Aristotelian necessity. Otherwise, the functionality signified by this term could not supply us with grounds for instance, viewing generosity and reliability, but not vindictiveness and arrogance as virtuous motivational patterns. Close quote. Anscombe argued that central aspects of virtue, for example, refusing to engage in murder as a means to an end, could not be understood in terms of Aristotelian necessity. Miller's gloss on her refusal to seek a grounding for prohibitions on murder in Aristotelian necessity is, I think, right. Anscombe's writing on the topic takes a less abstract tack. Given that the one wronged by murder is in the first instance the victim, Anscombe writes, quote, if someone is wronged, he has a right which is violated, but the wrongfulness of murder seems to be the basis of the right rather than vice versa, because A, there is not a simple right to life, but rather a right not to be murdered, and B, if there were a certain right to life upon which the wrongfulness of murder is based, it would be difficult to see why it should not be waivable. The prohibition on murder is indeed a great charter right to all of us, but it is the prohibition that comes first and not the right. Close quote. She goes on to argue that the aspect of human nature at issue in prohibitions on murder is something on the order of the spiritual nature of human beings, which is a sort of source of supra-utilitarian value. In other writings, she brings together this thought with specifically theological concerns about the ultimate end of human life. A lot of contemporary philosophers may be unwilling to follow her that far, but she does, I think, supply us with grounds to be suspicious of the general extension of her thought about an Aristotelian necessity to cover the whole field of morality. Okay, that's meant to give you a way into a bunch of different aspects of Anscombe's work on ethics. I hope it was clear and helpful. And of course there's no questions because it was too complicated. Yes?
So I have a question about you're saying one of the aspects of stopping modals is distinct from Aristotle's account is that there should circumstances, and sort of no further circumstances. And so what I'm wondering is, what triggers the applicability, or kind of, in my mind, I'm kind of looking at what's kind of grounding that force of the stopping model. And then you kind of talk a little bit, it seems like it's sort of grounded in nature, or sort of like, but it seems, I guess I'm getting tripped up by the fact that we're talking about stopping models very much as if they're linguistic tools.
Mm-hmm.
But then we're also talking about these sort of moral obligations, which are not simply linguistic tools. And I'm having a little trouble kind of connecting.
Okay, thank you. There's a fairly broad region of the ethic. Sorry, the question was, what about these stopping modals? On the one hand, here, is this helpful? On the one hand, you seem to be linking them to all these various things, but on the other hand, you're supposing that there's moral matters which are, of course, sometimes conveyed by these stopping modals. That's part of how you get the concept. You're saying that something about the stopping modal itself doesn't have any external circumstances that trigger it. And you're also saying that some of the things that are conveyed with the use of stopping modals do have a separate ground. Okay. She's having a characteristic complicated thought here. She feels like you're not providing a separate ground for the stopping modals in the following sense, that the right or obligation that go along with certain kinds of stopping modal, forcing modal pairs is partly constituted by the general deployment of those stopping modals. Like a social practice or an institution. So, for example, the various ways we have of conveying a promise set a promise apart from a mere expression of intention. Even a really, really solid expression of intention, like I will finish my grading this evening or something. A promise to say, send the grades I've assigned to my TAs before sunrise provides a special kind of context.
So that context adds like a moral weight.
She doesn't, she's part of why she focuses on promising is that it really is crucial to a whole lot of human good, right? And she rests it in the need to get other people to do my will and have that need dramatically outstrip the number of people who will do my will because they fear me, right? So it's in their interest to do what I want them to do, or love me, so they've got a different source of an interest to do what I want to do. Bank of America and I neither fear nor love each other, right? But it's through a contract that we've got that attaches a big debt to the place where I live, right? That a great deal of activity gets coordinated. Okay.
That's like a very different justification there's a lot of justification for not lying, for example, right? Not lying being moral and permissibility. And this justification for keeping promises seems almost like a socially constructed justification.
It is a social, but that's because the possibility of the good in question is also socially constructed. Without such socially constructed matters as institutions of property, right, it would be impossible for the economy that we enjoy, right, that's responsible for most of our means of subsistence and stuff becoming available to us in varieties of ways, would not be possible, okay? So you couldn't have a modern economy without institutions of property and without the linguistic practices involved in contract, okay, and also law governing property and so on, okay? So it's a kind of human good that is made possible by a system of institutions, right, she's thinking that that the obligation to do your word is grounded ultimately in that kind of common good. So this is an instrument for the attainment of a kind of common good. Okay? She doesn't believe you can owe anything to yourself. Just like Aquinas doesn't believe you can owe anything to yourself. I've got a new paper coming out called You Owe It to Yourself. It starts with a quote from the Mikado. But even Kant thought that it at least generated an antinomy on the grounds that it's not, if I owe something to myself and I'm the source of the law, then I'm also the one who can exempt myself from that very law. So if it's all me, what's to prevent me from obliging and releasing myself willy-nilly? So she doesn't think it's possible to owe things to yourself or to legislate for yourself or any of that. Right.
As I was listening to your paper, I guess maybe I'm inviting you to reflect a little bit on her, or maybe draw out more. How much do you think her experience as a wife and mother of 7 is behind this paper? Because, like, as I was listening to it, I was just thinking, well, maybe this is like the difference between Descartes and Vico, right? Because Descartes develops rationalism sitting in a cold room in Northern Europe by himself next to a stove that's hardly working, right? Whereas Vico is writing his treatises that led to his development of the new science based on nature and history and memory, while staying up all night, having to take care of 7 kids, and he was literally writing many of his now more famous philosophical discourses, trying to attend to his wife and 7 children. Right, so I wonder. I mean, maybe you could just say, I don't know, say a little bit. How much do you think that's behind her motivation, even for this approach to?
I think that.
And also trying to make it academically, robust, as opposed to just, rules on the refrigerator. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think. I actually think that she's brilliant on the topic of the way in which the world is a source of moral education for children from a very young age, from a really, really young age. I mean, one of the aspects of Wittgenstein's approach, who was not a father or anything, as far as I know, was that he thought it was important to try to figure out how somebody could have got a concept in trying to talk about the sorts of concepts with which people were working. And that was a big question. That's part of the source of the trouble about empiricism, is that it's a total mystery, right? And she, according to her many children, at least, I take to have firsthand knowledge of the fact, she was constantly talking philosophy with her kids. And according to the more serious ones of her students, if you came to her as one of her students with a real, genuine philosophical question, you had her undivided attention. She might need you to help take care of the kids while she was giving you her undivided, philosophical attention. But you had her undivided attention if you had a real question. If you came to her with a theory and a pompous sense of being on top of it all, she would destroy you verbally in like 3 seconds flat. So I always think I learn more about what sort of questions people asked her when I hear whether somebody thought she was the kindest, most generous person they ever met intellectually, or was inclined to call her Dragon Lady, as many people were. So, of course, she was very engaged in the moral education of her children, and she also understood that the whole world the children were inhabiting was that everything that spoke to a child, whether it did so in language or not, was part of the moral, was a source of the moral education of children. She was pretty alive to that. I think she felt like she had a lot of first-hand experience with what Aquinas called synderesis.
Maybe for everyone, could you, and for myself, could you maybe back up a little bit and just give a little more of an account of what are stopping modals, forcing modals, what are stopping modals, forcing modals, and then maybe a little bit as to why we care about their analysis and why we care about what's sort of grounding them or justifying them.
Okay. I think you could say that, in a sense, you could say that all of them are grounded in what's needful in human life. But the ones that are involved in a lot of social institutions, like promising, or property, or civil authority, those kinds of institutions, are instruments in human good.
Could you give some examples of, is promising a stopping modal?
You can't spend that money. We have to pay the rent. We can't go on holiday to Fiji. We have to pay everything else too. You can't pursue, this is a sacred vow kind of promise, so one of the ones that's pretty rare. You can't pursue that kind of intimate relationship with this person. You're under a vow of chastity, in a different sense of the vow of chastity. Like you've vowed obedience and chastity and poverty and those kinds of things. So you're not allowed to do certain things because you're in an order, a spirit.
Come out of like a promise.
Well, they come out of some come out of promises. Some come out of things that are not promises. I have to pay my taxes. I'm a U.S. citizen. I never wrote a contract or did any of that. And she's got really powerful objections to trying to give a contractual analysis of that sort of obligation. It's a thing I owe to the state, right? Like serving on the jury.
And how are they paired? Because you were referencing a lot of
Stopping forcing. I can't use this as though it was discretionary income because I have to pay a set of debts this month. Can't just go on a spending spree. Must pay the debt. The must pay the debts is a forcing modal. It's what I have to do. The would love to go to Fiji but can't afford it right now is a stopping modal that's related to that forcing modal.
Do they always come in pairs?
She thinks that they always come in pairs in the following sense. If I must respond appropriately to the summons to jury duty, that means I can't ignore it.
You were saying something about the stopping modals being giving you more freedom than the forcing modals. But if they always come in pairs, then how can you?
Because what the forcing modal tells me is that I must respond to the jury summons. That leaves open a variety of ways of responding even to a jury summons. I can, for example, petition the court to be let off on the day that I'm called and asked to have it rescheduled for another day because my mother's having open heart surgery that afternoon. I can, there's various ways I can respond. I must pay our bills, but there's a lot of income left around the side after I've actually sent off all of the checks. That is presumably mine to dispose of in whatever way I like. I could put it in savings, I could throw parties, I could go hog wild at the liquor store. I mean, there's any number of things I could, new shoes, glasses that actually work, something like that. There's a number of things that are left open to me, right? I mean, the things that Anscombe is willing to count as prohibitions, part of why she thought that society had already gone to hell on a handcart was that she thought that in the Oxford, does Oxford philosophy corrupt the youth? No, they were already corrupted, is that the political and social context she was in meant people had gone soft on murder, she thought, that political circumstances were such that people were willing to countenance taking murderous means to ends, and they'd also gone soft on adultery. Lack of faith in the institution had led people to go soft on adultery. And I think she felt that at the point that you've gone soft on adultery and soft on murder, what is it that's left to sort of stiffen your spine in a certain kind of way? Now,
she saw just a social need for this account.
So she thought that actually she was trying to do an analysis of the concept of right, rule, and the whole set of obligations that are associated with thought about rights and rules. And she came to believe that rights and rules are social constructions that have their first existence in the learning to use certain kinds of linguistic instruments to govern conduct. So, if I've got a really little child that I'm minding, and my really little child is heading like this for the stairs, crawling toward the stairs, a thing I can do if I'm nervous is pick up the child and point the child in a different direction, and the child will crawl in a different direction, right? Once the child is older, I can start using no, right? And eventually, the no becomes enough to change the child's movement. But she thinks that the negative stuff ends up coming first in moral education, partly because once you've gotten the boundaries around the things that are maybe okay set with the prohibitions that form this like little ring of don't cross this line or that line or that line, what's left in the middle is a huge, indefinitely many things that might be good to do here and now.
That's like the step from commonness to being virtuous.
Yeah. So all of that, there's a huge range of things, and she was really smart about the fact that there's always more than one way to get something that's needful and good. Like philosophers' examples are artificial. They're as artificial as economic models, which happily, usually, on a simple one, give you infinitely many things to do that will be equally beneficial and meet the constraints. And on a complicated one may give you an n-dimensional vector, right? Space, things that that satisfy the demands equally. Well, it's partly because there's almost nothing that counts as an action, right? And the parameters constrain the context so tightly.
So she's basically, at a high level, she's just getting a very it's kind of like a very bottom-up grounding for these essentially moral prohibitions that she was finding being kind of lacking.
Right, but she thinks that grounding finds its ultimate destination in the fact that we're not just animals, discursively reasoning animals, but that we're spiritual beings. That gives us a distinctive kind of a destination, she thinks. And that And and that's for her part of human nature. A lot of people who love her would never go there. They'll try to find something other than that as a way to ground prohibition, which is actually really hard to do. I've been trying to work on it for a long time to see if there is a way to do it without divine law. Yes?
So if virtue and ultimately the fact that we're a certain kind of being, the grounding for all of these kind of modals, why is she, or are you in your paper at least insistent that stopping enforcing modals have to fall into specific logos types? Why is it necessary to make that sort of, those distinctions between the different types?
She just thinks that they have different themes. In this, she's really like a lot more like Aquinas than like contemporary folks are, contemporary Anglophone philosophers are. So, for example, we're at Harvard. It is an ambition of some forms of contemporary thought about justice to suppose that you can understand the whole of justice if you locate certain basic principles and attach these to certain things that you're regarding as basic goods, okay? It's not just Harvard, but it got really famous here. If you read Aquinas on something like justice, there's no reason to think that the same principles are going to apply to all the departments of justice. Right? There's very distinct departments of justice. And this is not like Walzer on spheres, exactly, but it's closer to Walzer on spheres than it is to an attempt to come up with, you know, the principles of law or the principles of justice, which are Anglophone contemporary philosophy ambitions. So, for example, to extend a little bit on Aquinas on the topic, there's a certain kind of justice that belongs to the family. One of the features of the kind of justice that belongs to the family is an appreciation of the fact that a female, the adult female member of a family is differently vulnerable than the adult male member of the family, because the female member of the family will undergo pregnancy and certain forms of very early, oversee certain forms of very early childcare. And that means that you can't have the same like man law and woman law inside the family, because that, whatever the strictures are governing the life of a family, it's got to take into account the distinctive strengths and vulnerabilities of the different participants, if that makes sense. By the same token, I think you could extend his remarks on the law governing contract in such a way that it would be totally repugnant to suppose that there's going to be different man law and woman law in matters of commerce. Right? If you're greeting as contracting parties in some sort of an exchange, it shouldn't make any difference what sex the parties to the contract are. So you're not going to have the same kinds of rules governing contract as you're going to have governing justice in the family. You're not going to have the same kinds of rules governing just relations between friends as you have between all fellow citizens as such. I mean, how could you? These are really different domains. Does that help? So, and Anscombe is with him on this kind of thing. Anscombe's thinking that the different logos types pertain to the different domains of human activity and what's needful in the relevant domain.
So those logos types are descriptive.
Yeah. Classificatory, she calls them themes.
So it would be a way you pick like a family logos type or something, and then that's sort of within that realm you can kind of figure out how these work. And then if it's not working, say, well, maybe I go the wrong logos, then classify them the wrong way, so then try again, and then so it's like, well, these spheres, and we have to do it right.
I I mean, for example, the stuff on moral authority that her first place to locate that discussion is in the family logos type, because the argument is that without somebody having the ability to command obedience on matters of what's right and wrong, virtuous and vicious, you can't raise children. Right? So parents have to have that authority. Okay? It's pretty clear that, say you've got 5 kids and you introduce me to them, it's not going to be my place to give them a different kind of moral world than the one that you have provided for them. Because I'm a stranger. I'm coming in from outside. Saying, no, it's Shabbat, or something. They can't be playing video games today.
Yeah, thanks. So you'd argued that Aristotelian necessity can't account for some of these sorts of phenomena, and I'm wondering if you think there's other parts of Aristotle's ethics, or maybe Aquinas' ethics, that provide some sort of grounding for against some of these thoughts and these matters.
As near as I can tell, there are 2 things I know about Anscombe's relation to Aquinas. One was that she turned to him all the time for help trying to think about tough issues. So she was she sort of would do a thematically directed dive into a bunch of Aquinas periodically. The other is that, as near as I can tell, the sort of divine law that she has in mind in modern moral philosophy is natural law in Aquinas. Right. On a reading of natural law in Aquinas, I mean, the closest to a contemporary reading of natural law in Aquinas that I can get to fit with the things that she said is actually Stephen Brock's reading of natural law in Aquinas, which is kind of amazingly brilliant, and as yet, at least the first draft of it, downloadable for free on the internet as his doctoral dissertation, and really worth the read. It's called The Legality of Natural Law in the Philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. He's doing a revision of it that's going to come out on CUA in a couple of years, and we'll have to pay for it. But right now, it's freely available. That's very close to the way that she's reading Aquinas. Okay. Part of why it's really close is that it's very grounded. So, it's a really amazing take on the sense in which natural law is promulgated to us in human nature in Brock's reading. And I think that's very close to the way that Anscombe sees it promulgated to us in human nature. And it's not through a bag of goods. It's not like, here's a bag of goods, and we're going to pull a theory of practical reason out of a bag of goods. This is not the view. Yes.
So, on a more general level, you said there's this relationship that she draws between the concept of logos and divine law and divinity. What are some could you gloss some objections that have been brought up to Anscombe's claims recently, and how you think they may have failed or come short?
Okay. I'm currently working on a monograph on all of Anscombe's philosophy. I'm that stupid. Okay. Which means I have to read all of it a lot. As far as I know, almost nobody cottoned on to the stuff she did on stopping modals. Nobody loved that. But I actually think it's kind of brilliant myself. So I actually think that she may be right, that some of the forms of human good at issue in ethics are humanly constructed sometimes historically inflected, and culturally inflected. Different societies have different ways of marking the boundaries between what things are mine and what things are not. Different societies have different ways, even though it's hard to imagine a human society that doesn't regard some forms of the killing of other human beings as problematic. It's wrong. Different cultures have different ways of marking out the kinds of killing of human beings that are not okay. And usually not okay no matter what, right? Homicide is a thing that people do. Some forms of homicide wind up looking okay in various societies, and some wind up being dramatically restricted. When you've got an actually morally prohibited act type, one way to tell that you've got one is to notice that an enormous amount of human attention goes into try to figure out what counts as an act of the relevant type. So in Europe and North America, for about the past 20 years, rape, people have worked really, really hard to figure out what kinds of engagement with another person, physical engagement with another person, count as rape. Like, when I was a little girl, there was no such thing as marital rape. You couldn't imagine a case that would counted as one spouse raping another spouse because, of course, spouses have conjugal access to each other by definition, so how could you rape? That sort of thing. A lot of effort went into trying to make it possible for people to conceive of that. Okay. A term that got invented after World War II to cover a crime against humanity, genocide, another place where you've seen an enormous amount of attention devoted to trying to figure out what counts as genocidal. Obviously, if my people round up all of your people and systematically mow them down, that's genocide. But it's also genocidal if instead of anything that blatant, what happens instead is that my people take away your children, won't ever let them learn your language or your culture, anything to do with your culture, and raise them up to be just like my people. That's also a way of trying to attack a whole people, right? So these are prohibited act types. And it's still, at least at the University of Chicago, my students are worried about all kinds of things about ethics, but they recognize moral prohibition. You can get them to laugh by saying genocide is never okay, even if it's a filthy little people that none of us would miss. They laugh, like, of course. Even a filthy little people that nobody would miss, we're not allowed to wipe them out for our convenience or in order to make smoother relations on the continent or anything like that. They recognize a bunch of actual moral prohibitions. To ground moral prohibitions, she thinks, you actually need to go all the way down to something about the spiritual nature of human beings. It's not the prohibition on things like murder, genocide, rape, and so on is not grounded in some external, it's not those prohibitions aren't instruments to some kind of human good that might be managed in some other way, for example. Okay? In a funny way, if you think, whereas other things, systems of contract or property or something like that, various forms of civil authority, there might be other ways for people to manage to work something out. But, and it's only these contingent facts about the complexity of modern society that require that we have a distinct civil authority with coercive power and so on. But you could imagine a world where that wasn't the case with human beings in it. partly because there hasn't always been such a thing as a modern state. Right? So somebody was figuring out something along the way. But with the things like the prohibition on murder, basically, for Anscombe, things that go to, particularly things that go to the beginning, the end, or the necessary sociality, basic sociality and culturation and stuff in human life, you're going to get a series of prohibitions that are rooted in us as not just natural beings who need to get each other to do things, but as spiritual beings where we need to have reverence for one of them, not just leave them enough room to do what they want or something.
Yeah, thanks. Do you think that she's more or less with Aquinas on this? Because it's my understanding that for Aquinas, that he thinks that like the natural law can get us to things like the Ten Commandments and those sorts of prohibitions.
Yeah, I think she's kind of with Aquinas on that. He thinks that's fruits of natural reason, and except for, and even in Aquinas, but
do you think he would say that you need the spiritual nature to account for the Ten Commandments, or just
not,
natural reason?
I think, the difficulty I have in figuring this bit out of Aquinas, and I know that other scholars, a lot of scholars don't, they can't figure out how far you can get with natural reason alone. Like, so there are some scholars who think you can't actually get the Decalogue to drop out of natural reason. I mean, I'm not sure that you could get the first commandment to drop out of natural reason, even if you can get.
Or keep the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Right.
It's certainly a beholder.
Yeah.
Maybe yeah.
So, but I mean, it's like the thing about at least in my, the interesting thing about the first commandments is that it's hard to imagine keeping it without extra help. At least, it may just be that I'm not sufficiently, whatever. It's not, but I.
But doesn't Aquinas argue? I mean, you can have natural knowledge of God, and like this one must. Doesn't he think that you can get to understanding of God just through reason alone, and even one?
He
God?
thinks you can get to the existence of God by reason alone, and he seems to think that if you can get to the existence of God, you can get to one God by reason alone. Getting to a triune God by reason alone, no way.
Right. But is that enough for the Ten Commandments?
It depends. The problem is it's a point of disputation among scholars whom I'm a midget compared to the scholars who are engaged in disputation on this. It's true that I've been reading him for more than 25 years at this point. But I haven't mastered all of the commentaries on Scripture, to tell you the truth. I don't take myself to be a proper scholar, partly because I started reading him to understand Anscombe's intention. So I figured this book has a ghost author, can't be Aristotle, because this is really not Aristotle. Let's see, she was a Catholic. Maybe it was Aquinas. And then I just, not knowing any better, just sort of went and started checking out facing page editions, the facing page edition of the Summa in our library, one volume at a time, until I'd read through the whole thing, and ended up deciding this is the best philosophy I've ever read, and then just kept reading, right? So I have no proper training, and I have deep respect for those who have had a proper formation. They disagree about how far you can get. Everybody agrees you're not going to get a triune God out of natural reason. You do need revelation. But, it's like a lot of philosophers stop at the first objection to the first question in the Prima Secundae, right? It's like, well, but surely anything you get from methodical use of natural reason will get you everywhere, and the answer is no. So I think she didn't think that there could be any distinctive ethical precepts that you needed revelation to know. So she at least thought that that distinctive ethical precepts would be available to you without revelation. I don't know if she thought that the justification for them could be available to you without revelation. And that seems the stronger claim. There are scholars of Aquinas who think that the justifications for a lot of them are available without special revelation. There are other scholars of Aquinas who disagree with that. Anscombe at least thought that God couldn't suddenly spring one on us, an actual ethical precept from, ex nihilo or something that had nothing to do with the kinds of beings we were and the kinds of things that the kinds of challenges we faced. Does that help?
So I'm wondering if you can extend the notion of Aristotelian necessity in such a way that you might be able to place some role in explaining some of this. So I guess the thought is, so maybe you could provide an account where it's necessary in order to be a just person to keep your promises. It's necessary in order to be an honest person. And then that would be kind of a justification for this stopping morals and forcing morals.
I don't. It's interesting that honesty is not an ancient Greek virtue.
Yeah.
It's partly because Odysseus was an ancient Greek hero and was notably dishonest. But I think there are clear task-based discussions of a lot of the virtues in Aquinas, okay? And the tasks are going to common good in the relevant sense. And Anscombe was, as near as I can tell, pretty deeply influenced by those discussions. You would have separate man law and woman law in the family because, right, one of those partners is bearing children, and that's a distinctive form of vulnerability. So the task-based way of thinking about virtue is the instrumental way that goes along with Aristotelian necessity. Now, Aquinas's argument for the prohibition on lying is weirdly like Kant's, although it's grounded in what's needful in human life. What assertion is for is a certain kind of communication of things we take to be true. And that's a fundamental way of engaging in discursive reason, is through those kinds of conversation. And so we have to be able to rely on what others say. We have to be able to rely on testimony in all kinds of ways. And so you would it's a kind of sin against human reason to tell lies. And that's not that far removed from how Kant grounds a prohibition on lying. Okay. But so in that sense, it's Aristotelianly necessary that I be honest, even though honesty is not a notable Aristotelian virtue. And none of the Christian virtues count as a notable Aristotelian virtue, really. Right. Magnificence is not the same as caritas, or even liberality, exactly.
Can I ask a question? So you've argued that the ultimate grounding of these fundamental prohibitions is in the sacredness of human life and sort of what is and isn't an appropriate response. Do you think in this picture it can also be the case that the teaching of the prohibitions is part of how we learn to recognize the sacredness of human life? So from the point of view of a young child, sort of, you learn who other people are by being told you don't get to treat them that way.
Yes. I think she thinks that, and I think Aquinas thinks that, and I think they're both right. Yeah, I mean, that's how you learn what a person is. It's through this kind of stuff. Yes?
Given that there's different, parents raise their children differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the first part of this moral education. Is there a point where the stopping or forcing modals don't really work, especially in terms of like kind of using it as a phrase, where for you, do they only refer to yourself in your own moral education, or to where you could say, I'm married, so that stops you from doing certain actions, but for someone else who's not raised in that same moral tradition, that wouldn't hold it for them, and therefore that would create kind of a conflict between how that functions, or is there not really an interaction in that way?
The way Anscombe puts it is that in learning what property is, you also learn what theft is. In learning what marriage is, you also learn what adultery is. There's no way to get one of these without getting, so in learning what the good thing is, you tend to learn what one of the characteristic abuses of the good is at the same time. Right? I mean, there's not a way to only learn the good side. Right. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that Anscombe is fully aware that some people are brought up very badly indeed. That's not right. But she thinks that even if you're brought up badly, this is part of why I think that she's holding on to something like what Aquinas called synderesis. Even if you're brought up badly, something in you is trying for the good. Now, you may have a really twisted understanding of what that is if the circumstances in which you're raised are sufficiently ethically twisted, okay? But the drive toward the good, that I think she, Aquinas, and Agustin all think that can't get blotted out from your heart, even if you make a lot of mistakes. Does that help?
Yeah.
So you sometimes read about children who are raised in dreadful circumstances, but get an idea that something else might be possible from like a dumb television show or a not especially exciting book or something like that, or seeing the neighbors do things differently, maybe. But the kids are so hungry for what's good that even if it turns out to be different from what their parents approve of, something in kids goes for that. And kids are much smarter about that than adults generally allow, in my experience.
Can I just ask you a question about this issue of the ethical precepts that are available to unaided human reason, supposedly? So more or less, I take it that in Aquinas, more or less, all non-ceremonial such precepts are purportedly available to unaided human reason. But I just wondered what you thought about the suggestion that there's a kind of a certain difficulty that arises if one also has particular views about what those precepts are, such as, for example, they prohibit homosexual activity or, say, artificial contraception, because it's sort of just prima facie implausible to suppose that members of the relevant kind of pagan societies were culpable for I guess not realizing that homosexual activity was, etc. Similarly, in the modern era with artificial contraception, so it seems like the force of the idea that these precepts are available to unaided human reason is kind of pretty severely blunted, it seems to me, by the further proviso, and I think Aquinas does talk explicitly about this, that access to these precepts is like radically dependent upon a culture that doesn't distort values, right? And every human culture distorts values.
Yes.
Like radically.
Yes.
On Aquinas' and Anscombe's plausible view.
Yes.
So where does that leave the rationalism?
Pretty severely circumscribed in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Aquinas recognizes that. I mean, it's very, look, a way to see how circumscribed. Suppose that I have everything required for full-fledged prudentia in Aquinas, right? So
that requires moral virtue.
Exactly. I've got all the moral virtues, all the acquired moral virtues, and the acquired practical wisdom that's operating in reciprocal relation with all the moral virtues. Mm-hmm. As near as I can tell, nothing in Aquinas suggests that this is going to obviate the need to go to confession, which means I will have good reason to regret and be sorry for some of what I do or fail to do, say or fail to say, think or fail to think, even if I've got prudentia in me. It's really hard to suppose why the phronimos would need to go to confession, I think. At least on some readings of Aristotle, it's hard to think how that would work. So he held that things stay hard, and that, and both of them are pretty keenly aware of the fact that even if what I do is in my power, which it has to be, it's not in my power to prevent the universe from throwing a set of novel circumstances my way that are going to make kinds of things that are usually good to do bad under my circumstances. I can't enclose myself in a bubble that will keep me from that kind of moral risk. So, to some extent, I have to do the best I can in the full understanding that I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. And that's I think, part of the force of that final bit in modern moral philosophy. Like, maybe I just have to rely on what I've got from custom and reason, even though I have to move forward with some doubt that I might be essentially wrong. And I think that use of essentially goes back to an understanding of the human being as a substance. Like, I could be wrong even about what I think is most centrally and crucially needful in human life. So I could be screwed from the root up. And I think she thinks that's just where we find ourselves. And I mean, if you read the kinds of alarming remarks about how to deal with infidels and stuff in Aquinas, and at what point it's okay to like deal very, very harshly with them, you sort of get a sense that he's not operating in a world where he's supposing that everybody's going to land on the right answer in virtue of the ordinary exercise of natural reason, because he believes that infidels can be wrong about really basic things in particular kinds of ways, and whether they're culpable for that depends on all kinds of things that may not have been under their control when they were forming their views. So I guess I think I'm inclined to just temperamentally and otherwise inclined to go with the readers of Aquinas who hold that no, you're not going to get this, the bulk of this, through the exercise of natural reason. All the stuff you're going to get is going to come through the sorts of cultural resources available to you, which will have, to some extent, had to adapt to the circumstances you're in. At this point, a thing that seems to be true of human beings is that it's in our power to destroy all of it, all of the earth, make it uninhabitable for any living thing. It was presumably not in our power to do that when Aquinas was working, really not in our power to do that when Aristotle was working, and only just beginning to be our power to do that when Anscombe was working, and we didn't even know any of the mechanisms at that point. I think that suggests that we've got a different sort of responsibility now, than we had in Aquinas' day. And that responsibility is born of the moral risk we've manufactured in developing the technological capacities, the exercise of which, right, could bring it down for every living thing on the planet. Now you could go back to being stewards of creation and locate a set of things there, but basically that looks to me like an area where we're at a kind of moral risk that we didn't used to be, and that means that we need to figure out what to do about being in that situation of moral risk. It sort of feels to me like a certain strand in medieval literature where people sort of felt like no sooner did a new kind of good become possible than indefinitely many ways of abusing it started to crop up all over the place, that aspect of human creativity was constantly with us. That seems true. Anscombe certainly thought so.
So on that note, we're out of time.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so now we have an hour and a half for lunch. Maybe the way we'll do this is we'll have each of the four speakers maybe sit at a separate table, and you can go up and then talk with any of them.
Then now it's a popularity contest.
Sure. Hour and 30 minutes, you guys have some time to digest all of this.
Maybe when they sit down, we could rotate. We could switch.
Yeah, we could. Fooled ya.
Let them switch.
Fooled ya.